This is a Socialist News and Views special interview.
I'm Nick Schillingford, coming to you from the Urban Cabin Studios in South Minneapolis with this special interview. So on Socialist News and Views, we let folks introduce themselves. Do you want to just tell our audience who you are?
Absolutely. My name is Kamana'okekai Lattig. I use she, he pronouns. I identify as Māhū, which is a Native Hawaiian gender identity. I am also myself Native Hawaiian, or Kānaka Maoli, which is how I'm going to be, what the terminology that I'm going to be using for this interview. And I am a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities.
Yeah, and you were nice enough to share your writing previously, your article on indigenous people to Hawaii, on Hula. And I admit I didn't really know much about Hula, really. Although, like I do about more maybe like, indigenous people to this area of the country. So, I knew it was a dance, and I knew that, it was something that was obviously related to Hawaii, and I knew that there was some indigenous roots. Can you talk about Hula and about your article examining traditional and commercial Hula, and then the kind of experience of indigenous Hawaiian diaspora throughout the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an article that I wrote in 2024, and I conducted the research that summer. Hula itself is something that I have always been really curious about to various extents throughout my life. So for some context, I grew up in Oregon, and my mom is from the Big Island and grew up there. But I grew up going on trips to visit family, and I never really understood any parts of my culture, because basically all we would do is sit at home and with my grandparents and watch football because it was Thanksgiving, and just not really involving myself in that culture. So as I was growing up, I had a very specific viewpoint of Hawaiian culture, which was what we saw in popular media, and which most people are familiar with, which is hula girls, the coconut bras, the grass skirts, fake plastic lei, luau parties, things like that aren't necessarily traditional to Hawaiian culture, but are things that have been very deeply intertwined with Hawaiian identity. So growing up, I was really, really invested in that kind of commercial aspect of my culture. I had a luau party from one of my birthdays. I wanted to wear the coconut bra, all those kinds of things, because I was so insecure in my identity as a Kānaka Maoli that I didn't really feel connected to it unless I was doing those things, because that's what I perceived to be Hawaiian. So I didn't really end up connecting to my culture fully until I got into academia, which is a little bit ironic because, right, academia is not, it's not a place where a lot of Kānaka Maoli or even indigenous people in general feel represented. Right. But I started questioning a lot of the things that I had been taught when I was growing up. To no fault of my mom, who also grew up in a time period where Kānaka Maoli culture wasn't necessarily something that was super talked about. It was just, sorry.
Just a quick, well, I was just, so were people in your family delivering some of these same messages to you, or were they just not like counteracting the like broader messages? I don't know, just kind of curious.
No, that's a good question. So my family, it's interesting because the Hawaiian language was banned for a really long time. So my family didn't have any roots in the language other than the kind of conversational, colloquial terms that they would learn in Hawaii, just being there in the space, which I didn't have. Right. And which my mom did have, but she didn't have the language. She also grew up in a time when Hawaiian culture was starting to be revitalized. So when I say this, I'm talking about the 1970s, where Kamana'okekai Lattig and all of these scholars were coming together and really pushing against the colonial stereotypes of Hawaiian people. And my mom told me that when she was growing up, you know, a lot of people were very critical towards those movements because that was what was ingrained in the culture at that point. Even the term Māhū, which I mentioned as a kind of Hawaiian third gender term, wasn't something that was used at all. It was used as a slur for anyone who was gay and anyone who was trans, but is originally a little Hawaiʻi word, a word in the Hawaiian language. So she grew up in this very Catholic household that was Filipino and Hawaiian. And, you know, my grandma taught her the traditions as best as she could, but a lot of those traditions had been lost because of the ban on the language, because of the illegalization of certain Hawaiian traditions, etc. Like that cultural knowledge was not passed down for that reason. So those stereotypes were not purposely perpetuated by my family, but definitely I would say were not discouraged in the way that my mom would probably discourage them now, in a time where we have access to that kind of information, which is really the main reason why I started that research project, is because I didn't have information growing up in the diaspora. As I talk about in my paper, hula practice was for most of our history, and still continues to be, a form of passing down our traditions, and it is legitimized by the kumuhulas, or the hula teachers that teach those traditions. So in the diaspora, we don't have access to that for the most part. The diaspora is very spread out across the US, but also across the world, because so many Kānaka Maoli are priced out of our ancestral homeland. So this research project was me trying to figure out, it was a very personal project, but it was me trying to figure out how and why I don't feel Hawaiian enough. And the conclusion that I really broadly came to was that we don't have access to cultural teachings in the same way that people in the islands do. Now that culture has been revitalized, now that hula has become a much more dominant practice in the islands, it's still not that way in the diaspora. Now, there were halau or hula studios that existed in Oregon, in Washington, even one in Minneapolis. Yeah, I didn't know that until I came here. I was like, wow.
I didn't know that, so it's interesting to know.
Right, yeah. And it's really awesome that there are ways that we can learn this and learn traditions. And at the same time, that's not very accessible to most people. And my hope for my research is to create more accessibility on these topics that diasporic Kānaka Maoli don't get to learn about. So on the kind of delving into my paper a little bit, the traditional and commercial hula are two categories that I created for the purposes of this paper. But even now, I'm pushing back on that terminology a little bit, just because even since I wrote this article, I feel like having those, black and white categories is doing a disservice to hula practice in general, because as I talk about in my article, a lot of hula practitioners both participate in hula that is for profit, hula that we see as commercialized, that I use the term commercialized, for the purpose of entertainment. It's the ones that we see in resorts. It's the ones that are pushed in luau parties that people host, that aren't necessarily keeping the Hawaiian traditions within that hula practice. But the hula dancers that participate in that also participate in oftentimes traditional halau. And they work to revitalize that practice and do partake in rituals and do these dances for various purposes, whether that be for the gods, for the ali'i, our chiefs, for our kapuna, our ancestors. It really just depends. There's a lot of purposes and functions for hula practice. But at the end of the day, a hula dancer who participates in commercial hula still may be participating in traditional hula practice. And that distinction is very fluid, because those dancers may still be using the same movements. They may be using the same choreography. They may even be choreographing that hula. However, it doesn't possess the same spiritual power, because it's not connected back to those rituals, and because it serves a different function. So I really delve into functionality in this article, because that is really what we can use to distinguish hula that is for profit versus hula that is for traditional use. So yeah, so that's a little bit of a rundown of my article. Where it kind of intersects with diasporic Kānaka Maoli is what I talked about with hula not being accessible, but the people who do practice hula in the diaspora feel a lot more confident in their identity as Kānaka Maoli. They feel a lot more solidified, and that I had that question of like, am I Hawaiian enough? A lot of these hula dancers do feel like they are, because they are able to participate in something that is so foundational to our culture and foundational to our identity as a people. So after interviewing all those hula dancers, I really realized that is a way that we can connect. But learning about that, not even just learning hula, but learning about the way that we pass knowledge in the way that I have, is another way that we can find connection with each other.
Well, I really appreciate the article, and it's already passing knowledge, because I'm already learning things that I didn't know before. And now hopefully we're going to be sharing this with more people. I just wanted to, just quick, could you just give a few examples of the kinds of stories that might be passed on, or maybe just a couple examples from your work, and then I'll get into the next thing?
Yeah, I can absolutely give a few more, because hula practice is repetitive. Performance is repetitive, and that's something that Judith Butler talks about, a renowned gender scholar. She talks about gender being a performance, but the aspect of performance being repetitive is what legitimizes hula practice. A lot of scholars are skeptical, or have historically been skeptical, about oral tradition as a way of passing down history, because word of mouth can be unreliable. Right. And maybe we don't remember things specifically, or maybe we leave out details. But hula practice is so repetitive and so ingrained by the kumu hulas. That is the function of the kumu hulas, is to ingrain those traditions and those stories. And that's how we've kept our stories. So a great example of this is not necessarily a hula dance, but it is a story that is passed down orally, is the Kumu Lipo, which is our genesis, our origin story, that the last queen, Liliuokalani, was the one to actually physically write it down and record it. It lists every single one of our gods and every single one of our ancestors in a very particular order, in a way that can be memorized. And that is actually how a lot of our uli, our chants, start, is by welcoming or acknowledging our ancestors. And that, I think, is a really beautiful example of how we continue to pass down that culture, because it's respecting the people that came before us, remembering who those people are and why they are important, and then demonstrating vocally, in this case, where our knowledge comes from. So that, I think, is my favorite example of hula practice, and how we can pass down orally.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to go on to the next thing, but just like, from my own practice and looking at evidence, with like learning specifically. I mean, we know that using more modalities, your eyes, your ears, your physical body is going to help you remember these things much better. So it seems quite obvious that, something like this is going to be a really good way, a really functional way to, continue to pass down knowledge between people. So I think that's really amazing. And I mean, I think, like I said, I think that's borne out by lots of other research in addition to, people's experiences. You talked a bit, or you touched on it a little bit already about sexual and gender stereotyping of hula that goes on. And also the kind of perspective you gained on the effect this has on Kānaka Maoli people across the globe. Can you just talk a little bit about that, about the gender and sexual stereotyping that's gone on, that's kind of like mischaracterized some of the things in hula practice?
Totally, yeah. It's really interesting because this is another one of the big reasons why I wanted to look into this project, right? Was understanding what kind of impact that has on the diaspora. I mean, if you live in the islands, you have the touristic viewpoint of, what a Hawaiian woman or what a hula girl should look like, but you also have your community around you to model what that might look like in a way that isn't overtly, sexualized or exotified. But in the diaspora, you don't have that community aspect. You just have whatever society is kind of throwing at you, which is the hula girl stereotype. And that is a huge part of my project. The hula girl stereotype is very similar to the kind of the Indian princess myth that was created into the American mythos. It's this idea of a soft primitivity in the native woman of being this, beautiful, exotified, skinny woman who is supposed to demonstrate the morality of a native people's, like the moral side of a native people's, juxtaposed with the masculine version, which is typically portrayed as this savage Indian, that kind of stereotype. So It's very similar in Hawaiian stereotypes, with the hula girl being the most prominent figure of Hawaiian identity, or the way that people perceive Hawaiian identity from the outside. I grew up with this stereotype. I grew up with people telling me that I should dance the hula, that I look like a beautiful Hawaiian woman. More recently, I've had people telling me that I look like Moana, and that, I should do X, Y, and Z, or Hawaiians lived in grass, etc. Those kinds of stereotypes are inherently harmful, especially for, a young feminine person to be hearing constantly. So that is something that once I actually got into academia, and once I kind of got into high school, was something that I started critiquing and was very cynical towards, because I felt very victimized by it. And I felt I felt like I was being objectified in my day-to-day life. And going into this project, I was really, really trying to critique that and trying to find the roots of that. Which is a very valid critique, and I stand by everything that I've said about it. It's objectifying, it's exotifying, it sexualizes Native Hawaiian women in a way that is extremely harmful and perpetuates various harms onto us. But when I was doing my interviews with the hula dancers, what I learned was that the people who were hula dancers in diaspora, the people who were able to, had access to that practice, or had moved from Hawaii to diaspora and had done hula dance there, were very self-assured, in a similar way to that, how they were self-assured of their own Hawaiianness. One of my participants, Lili Noe, told me that she didn't care about that stereotype. She said blatantly, like, it's not true. I've never felt like that. I've always thought that it was silly, that it was something that didn't apply to me and that didn't matter. Whereas a lot of the people who I talked to that weren't hula dancers in the diaspora had always felt very uncomfortable with this image in a different way, not necessarily because we thought it was silly, but because we thought we had to fit into that mold of the hula girl, of the perfect Hawaiian woman. So that gender stereotyping that comes from the touristic viewpoint of Kānaka Maoli is it really impacts the people who don't have access to hula practice, which I thought was interesting because I honestly thought it was going to be very universal. I thought that it was going to be something that everybody who was Hawaiian or who was a feminine bodied person in Hawaiian culture would experience, but it isn't because of the community backing and because of the knowledge that has been imparted on those people by their kumuhulas. So I thought that was really, really beautiful. And then, the other side of it, the masculine side, is something that we don't talk about as much because we see the hula girl stereotype as that kind of paradigm of paradiesal life in Hawaii. And that is something that I've kind of vaguely been aware of, is the primitive Hawaiian man, something that I saw at my observations of I did observations at the luau of the Hilton Resort. So, this is one of those commercialized hulas.
Right.
It was interesting.
That was your worst example, or
yeah, exactly. No, exactly.
Least traditional example.
Yeah. It was, blatantly at the other side of the spectrum. That the men that were performing were very sexualized and very sexual, dancing in a very sexual, masculinized way, that even though this Legends of Hawaii was trying to project a pre-colonial image of what hula looked like, the dancing itself was not that, because traditional Kānaka Maoli, I keep saying the word traditional, even though I said I would push back on it. Pre-colonial Kānaka Maoli dance, there was no distinction between masculine and feminine dancing at all. It was the same dance, and there were certain dances that were for men only, and certain dances that were for women only, based on who was being worshipped or what was being worshipped. But those dances didn't necessarily have a gendered label attached to them. But when Kalakaua, one of our kings, the last king before our final queen, Liliuokalani, he brought back hula for this festival called Merry Monarch, and it became a transnational practice. So once it became transnational, there's this audience, this globalizing audience that was looking at hula with Western eyes.
Right.
So once, that was the first wave, and then once this next wave of hula revitalization came from the 1970s that I talked about earlier, a lot of men were very uncomfortable with this performance, because it was seen as feminine by the Western gaze. That's what had been portrayed for all of those years. So a couple of kumuhulas in the 70s that I had the pleasure of talking to had very different perspectives on the way that masculine hula is presented. One of them created this entire hula thread, this hula lineage that is hypermasculine, that was accessible to men in the 1970s, who, a lot of them were like being called slurs for being gay because they wanted to participate in this act. But this socially allowed men to participate in hula, despite its previous feminine connotations. One of the other kumuhulas that I talked to had a very different approach. Same time period, just two different threads of hula, two different lineages. He was really interested in keeping a non-gendered lens on hula practice, continued to do hula, or created a hula lineage that was accessible to both to all genders, but didn't have a particular, like, this isn't hyper masculine, and it could be perceived as hyper feminine,
Right.
but he didn't care because that it was just what he saw to be traditional hula practice. So it, all of this being said, you can see where the Western gaze has really impacted the Kānaka Maoli view of masculinity, of what it means to be a Hawaiian man, what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like, and how we are kind of fighting against that and have continued to fight against that throughout history. So those gender roles, those gender stereotypes that come from hula practice don't actually come from hula practice itself, but are a byproduct of the Western gaze that has been scrutinizing Hawaiian culture for so many years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this hula girl image, is also part of like I don't know, the colonial drive to, like make their the people they're planning to oppress look pliable and weak, and that they can do whatever they want. And so again, that's that's part of like, part of that is putting that into other people's minds as well, but also into people's minds that are going to experience that oppression, that there's there's nothing that they can do about it, that they're that they have no control of their own lives. And I know some socialists out there would probably say that learning about Kānaka Maoli people is interesting, and they're interested in it, but it's not really like necessary to building the kind of movements that we want to see, building socialist movements, or fighting for a better world. I would disagree with that. But I mean, do you have thoughts on the importance of this knowledge and the importance about understanding Kānaka Maoli people, especially if you're an American, I think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I really appreciate this question because I have gotten the relevance question before, like, why does this matter to me as someone who is in, Illinois,
Right.
for example? Because on the surface, it doesn't seem like it would be translational, but when you really look at the Kānaka Maoli history, we had sovereignty before the US even came. And a lot of our current activism has to do with getting land back and overthrowing who overthrew us in the first place. And I think there's a lot of principles of our movements that can be really translational to a lot of socialist movements, and already are translational.
Right.
We have this concept of kokoa, which is to take care of each other within these movements, and to lift everybody up from the ground, not necessarily just the people who have the power to change things, but the people, the maka'aina, the common people who this affects more than anyone else. A lot of our relationships with our sovereignty has been before colonization, has been reciprocal. It is very, very reciprocal. Everybody is very dependent on the actions of the people, in the same way that the people are very not even dependent on the actions of the sovereign ruler, but the sovereign ruler is just meant to represent the people in a globalizing world, which was what was happening around the time that we gained sovereignty. So I think that those fundamentals that we practice, this very commercialized spirit of aloha, of love, of caring for one another, kokoa, of helping each other, kuleana, of our duty to protect one another, and our individual functions in a society that can come together and really support each other. Those are things that I think can be used in various movements. I mean, for me, like I think about, I've been getting a little bit involved in Anakbayan, which is a Filipino socialist organization that is very against the current Marcos, who is in office right now. And a lot of their fundamental principles are very similar to mine as someone who is Kānaka Maoli and who is a practicing Kānaka Maoli. as someone who is involved in politics or trying to be involved in politics, that these principles can really create new perspective that is not just, I mean, those principles exist, but when you look at them from an indigenous viewpoint and understand the history from an indigenous viewpoint, it opens up a lot of opportunities that wouldn't necessarily exist in a Western context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, and the way that I look at it with the podcast is that, obviously the super rich people in this country that are pretty much all in total control of this country now at this point. No pretense or fake idea that maybe they're not. They're clearly in control of the levers of this country and everything. They have a lot of money, but we have the people on our side, so we need to be listening to all the people, because that's the only way we're gonna like fully see the system that we live in, all facets of the oppression and all this stuff that's going on right now, and then also how to resist that oppression. And I think like all of us have like definitely have some pieces from different parts of our life that we're going to bring to that. And I think only when a good, a significant portion of all of us are, like you said, working together, supporting each other, are we going to be able to defeat these forces that would like us to just shut up and do whatever they say, basically.
Totally. So to add to that, I mean, honestly, one of the things that really strikes me about Hawaiian culture that is very different from mainland culture, from continental culture, is something that I actually talked about in my paper a little bit, which is that individualism does not exist in the same way in Hawaii. You rely on people, you rely on your neighbors, and you rely on people that you've never met. My mom, when she moved to the continent, actually had this really huge culture shock, because she was used to just, when you see someone struggling, you help. You don't ask, you don't ask questions. You don't ask if they are like, if they've done X, Y, and Z.
Right.
It's very important to be protecting and taking care of each other in our culture. And that's, it became such a huge change for her. And even now, I have this I grew up in this Western mindset. So, I catch myself in moments when I realize that like the way that I am perceiving something is ingrained from what I was taught. Like my mom saw an older woman who was kind of struggling on the side of the street to get a package in her car. And I should have helped, and I didn't. I was just like, I have to get my mail and I have a meeting soon. But my mom, who was with me, just went over and immediately started helping. Didn't ask questions. This was like a couple months ago. And it reminded me of just how welcoming and how helpful and how supportive a lot of Kānaka Maoli are, which is something that has been taken advantage of by the capitalistic, individualistic world that we currently live in. So, I really appreciated that comment about people, about us having to really connect with each other. And, we have the people, and we have the ability to help each other. And, if we're not doing that, then how do we even create movements like this?
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's yeah, and like you said, people are getting priced out of even living in Hawaii. I actually very briefly, when I was little, I spent a couple of years growing up in New Zealand. And even, white people that are there that have lived there their whole lives are basically getting priced out of the market to even live there. People are living in like, vans or campers or whatever they can, because you can't afford to live there. And it's just, so imagine what, indigenous people to an area that probably are getting like, the worst sometimes the worst jobs. They're getting really like pushed down. I know that they're having to do everything they can just to hold things together, and everybody's looking at the you know ongoing genocide in Palestine. But again, like, pushing people off their land, taking away their language, like all these things, these are all parts of that process of genocide that has, that is already taking place and, continues to take place. So again, something we need to be aware of as we fight against the genocide that is all over the TV screens everywhere. I said, the article was really helpful. It was really interesting and really easy to like just get into. Had a really good vocabulary at the beginning, and everything was just well organized and easy to, like I said, easy to connect with, which is definitely not always the case with academic writings. In fact, the person who I had my master's in nursing, so we didn't have to like write a thesis or anything, but then the one PhD candidate for the nursing program, I read the title of their research and I was like, I don't know what that means. It was something in nursing informatics or something. And I was like, I don't know what that means. I was like, oh, I'll read the paragraph and that'll help me know what it means. Then I read the paragraph and I was like, I think I'm more confused about what this means now than I was when I read this. So I was like, I don't even know what that would be. I was like, I hope if I ever do a PhD in nursing, I write something that someone can understand. And they don't have to also be an expert in that field to read what it is. So like I said, I really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that wasn't covered so far, or anything else you want to share really about anything before you go?
I think I want to leave with an anecdote. This is a little bit of a longish story, so bear with me.
No,
but when I was first doing my research, my auntie immediately said, okay, I have someone for you to talk to. You're going to talk to this person. Like, you're going to stay with me, blah, blah, blah. She really, really helped me with this process. But the first person that I talked to on this research trip, after watching that, frankly, mind-numbing resort hula performance,
right.
I was very ready for something that felt real. And the first person that I talked to was Ranger Ime, who is a former hula practitioner that works at a heiau, which is a national park. The heiau, the word means temple, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's more of a space that has a lot of spiritual power. And I went with my aunt. She was really excited for me to listen to the ranger give a talk. She said that he would maybe give me resources. He was a PhD. He has a PhD and would love to give me advice. And I was very nervous about this because this is someone who has a lot of information about being Hawaiian. And at that point, I was really unsure of my identity. And when I talked to him, he was so beautifully helpful. He really helped me with getting participants. He got these world famous kumu hulas to participate in my research, and just was so wonderful to me. And I've, for some context, like, I have never been a very spiritual person. I've been very cynical about religion because I grew up with Catholic family. I, was very critical towards the Christianity and towards Catholicism because of this colonization that happened. And I was like, oh, this doesn't exist. This isn't real, blah, 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 whatever. And when I went into the heiau, I just felt this wave of spiritual energy that I cannot describe to you in words. I really can't. And which was really profound for someone who literally had never been very religious or spiritual at all. And this heiau, you're not allowed in there when the ranger was giving the tour, but he was, he let me go in there because he was just the nicest, most generous person ever, of course. So while all these tourists were walking around, we went into the heiau, and that moment really stuck with me. So when I came back to that side of the island after I did all the rest of my research, I really wanted to give him some kind of gift as to show my gratitude. So my auntie and I went to Volcano National Park, to Kilauea, and we got all these natural, all these native plants and flowers to make a lei po'o out of, which is the kind of headpiece lei, because we wanted to make one for him. And we both made them. Mine kind of sucked, so my aunts let me take hers to give to him.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I was like,
Very
oh,
fair, very good, very sweet.
yeah, I appreciated her for that because it would have been a little embarrassing. But when I came back to the heiau after having had this really impactful journey and learning about myself and learning about hula and learning about my culture, I went over to him and I was like, Ranger Imeike, this is a pseudonym, by the way. I can't say his real name. Right. I really wanted to give this to you because you helped me so much. These are all native plants to Hawaii, and I wanted to, offer my thanks. And he was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I'll give it to you. You should give it to your kupuna. Kupuna both means elders and ancestors. And in that moment, I was looking around for any old person. And I was like, I am not seeing a single old person in this facility. Who am I giving this lei to? I'm so confused. So he said, okay, follow me. And I followed him over to back where the heiau was, because we were kind of in the little national park gift shop area.
Okay, sure.
Really worked. And on the way there, I was talking to him and I was like, yeah, we took a trip out to Kilauea, we got these flowers from the Volcano National Park. And he stopped and turned to me and said, wait a minute, you didn't tell me it was from the national park. Like, you didn't tell me it was from Kilauea. And I got really freaked out. I was worried that I had done something wrong. And I was like, yeah, I mean, they are. Does that change things? Oh no. But he said, one of my friends came to me with a dream 3 days ago, and I didn't know what it meant. But the dream was that Pele, the volcano goddess, rose from the sea and presented herself to the heiau, to this temple, on the backs of the people who worked there, and asked for this interpretation. And I said that I didn't know. You just brought me flowers from her birthplace and presented it to me and to this heiau. And this marks the completion of this dream, and that the interpretation of this dream means that your research is important, and now you really have to give it this lei to our kupuna. So he took me to the shrine of our ancestors, and this is the shrine of King Kamehameha, the first king. And he told me that and this is something that I knew from my family, that I was descended from royalty, and that that is something that I only tangentially knew and kind of used as a bragging right when I was younger. But I was able to present this lei po'o to my ancestors, and in that moment, I really realized that this work is deeply important. And it goes beyond me. It might be my kuleana, my duty, but it means much more than that. And the work that we need to do as Kānaka Maoli scholars is still so vast, but it is something that is deeply important to our culture, and to pave that path for other cultures to be able to do the same. And that moment has really fueled my journey. I wasn't sure if I was going to get my PhD at that moment. I wasn't sure if I was going to continue what I was doing at the moment. But then when this happened, I realized that this was my purpose, and that I need to continue to do this. And my aunts called me later after I had been drinking, at the hotel that I was staying at before the airport. And she was like, Kamana, your name means power of the sea. And I was like, yes, it does. You're right. What? Like, I'm drunk. You need to be a little bit more specific about what you're saying. Yeah. And she was like, no, Pele got presented by the sea.
Right.
Your name means power of the sea. It was you. Like, you were the sea in this dream. It's not just that this was important. It's that you are the one who is presenting our gods to our people. And like, that means something. And I was like, whoa,
Right.
this is oh. And that I have not stopped thinking about that since that happened. I really haven't.
I believe
So
it.
if that inspires other people to do research like that and to really delve into their cultures, even if they don't feel like they belong in them, I will feel that I have done something.
Well, that's a beautiful story, important story, and I think we should leave it on that. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you so much. That was so much fun. I really appreciate it.
And that's the interview. Thanks for listening. Solidarity.
This has been a Socialist News and Views special interview.